Trump can't believe Mark Carney just banned the exportation of Canadian eggs to America to help boycott Trump's tariffs on Canadian food, leaving many Americans go hungry. Welcome viewers to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The backdrop was one of simmering tension, a slow burn that had been building for months. President Donald J. Trump had returned to the White House with a renewed mandate and a sharper, more aggressive focus on his America First agenda. This wasn't the tentative, exploratory phase of his first term. This was the confident, all-or-nothing approach of a man who believed his every action was a historical necessity. His target, as it so often was the tangled web of global trade agreements he saw as shackles on American industry. He spoke with a fire and brimstone rhetoric about foreign competitors, about unfair tariffs, about the need to protect the American worker. His administration had already imposed sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum, measures he justified as being in the interest of national security, a broad and powerful authority that few dared to challenge. But this time, he was ready to take it a step further. The new target was Canada. For decades, the two nations had operated under a presumption of friendship and seamless economic partnership, a relationship so close it was often described as being like family. But to Trump, family business was still business. He had long been critical of the North American trade relationship, viewing it as a lopsided deal that benefited Canada at the expense of the United States. And so, in a televised address that was broadcast live around the world, he announced a new round of tariffs. But these were different. They weren't just on raw materials or industrial components. They were on a host of Canadian-made consumer goods, the kind of things that a normal American family would find on their supermarket shelves or in their local hardware store. The list was extensive and deliberately provocative, including everything from dairy products to lumber and maple syrup. The public reaction was immediate and, in Canada, deeply wounded. The tariffs were seen not just as an economic measure but as a personal slight, a betrayal of a long-standing friendship. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, a man known for his intellectual rigor and strategic calm, appeared on television with a composed but stern expression. He spoke of his disappointment and reiterated Canada's commitment to a fair and balanced trade relationship. He promised that Canada would not be bullied and would respond with carefully calibrated and targeted countermeasures. It was the standard diplomatic language of a trade dispute, a game of political chess played with carefully worded press releases and polite, but firm, public statements. The world watched, expecting the usual back and forth, a slow, methodical escalation of tariffs and retaliatory duties. But what nobody knew, what not a single journalist or political analyst could have predicted, was that Carney had a different plan. He wasn't going to play chess. He was going to flip the board over. The American media, meanwhile, had a field day. Pundits debated the wisdom of Trump's tariffs, arguing whether they would help or harm the American economy. Some lauded the president's bold action, saying it was a long overdue move to protect American jobs. Others warned of a potential recession and the rising cost of consumer goods. But in the grand scheme of things, the tariffs were just another headline in a crowded news cycle. They were just one more battle in a trade war that had been raging for years. They felt distant, abstract, and removed from the everyday lives of most Americans. But that was about to change. Because while the media was focused on the political debate, the quiet, unseen gears of the global supply chain were already turning. Trucking companies were receiving new directives, customs agents were being briefed on new procedures, and trade representatives were holding frantic, late-night phone calls. The tariffs were a shock to the system, a disruption that would slowly but surely begin to impact businesses on both sides of the border. And for President Trump, this was all part of the plan. He had used tariffs before to force concessions, to bring adversaries to the table, and to project an image of American strength. He believed he had the upper hand, that he was the master of this game. He was convinced that Canada, with its smaller economy and deep dependence on the U.S. market, would have no choice but to fold. He was confident he had landed a decisive blow. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the resolve of his Canadian counterpart. Mark Carney was not a politician in the traditional sense. He was a central banker, a man who thought in terms of systems and leverage, of subtle pressures and strategic interventions. He understood that a conventional response, a tariff on American cars or bourbon, would only lead to a drawn-out, mutually destructive conflict. He needed a different kind of weapon, one that was so unconventional it would bypass the political noise and hit the American public directly. He needed to find a vulnerability that nobody had considered, a weakness that was not economic but psychological. He needed a symbol. And as he sat in his office, poring over trade data and supply chain logistics, his eyes fell upon a tiny, unassuming line item: eggs. The sheer scale of the trade was staggering. For years, Canadian eggs had been flowing across the border, a quiet, steady stream that had become an indispensable part of the American food ecosystem, particularly in the border states. Millions of eggs, every single day, were used in bakeries, restaurants, and grocery stores. The supply chain was so efficient, so integrated, that many Americans had no idea where their eggs came from. And that, Carney realized, was the key. He would use this quiet, invisible part of the economy to make a very loud and very public statement. He called his most trusted advisors into a private meeting. The room was tense, the air thick with the weight of the moment. He laid out his plan, his voice calm and steady as he explained the concept. The room fell silent. His advisors listened with a mixture of disbelief and awe. One of them, a grizzled veteran of a dozen trade disputes, shook his head slowly. "Prime Minister, this is insane. It's an act of war. They'll go ballistic. The public will turn against us." Carney just looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "Let them," he said. "Because by the time they do, it will already be over. This isn't about war. It's about a conversation. A very short, very pointed conversation." And so, the decision was made. A formal order was drafted, a single page of legalistic text that would send shockwaves across the continent. The exportation of Canadian eggs to the United States was to be banned, effective immediately. It was a move so unexpected, so unconventional, that it defied all logic. It was a gamble of the highest order. The fate of two nations, and the emotional equilibrium of millions of people, would now rest on a single, fragile carton of eggs. The first shot had been fired, but it wasn't the kind of shot anyone expected. It was a shot aimed not at an industry, but at the very fabric of daily life. The phone call from the Prime Minister's office had been terse and to the point. Mark Carney, a man whose life had been dedicated to the subtle, almost invisible levers of economic policy, was needed in Ottawa. He was no longer the governor of the Bank of Canada, but the nation's leader, a man who had earned his reputation for guiding economies through a storm, not for navigating political firestorms. He had steered Canada through the 2008 financial crisis with a steady hand, and later, as the head of the Bank of England, he had managed the chaos of Brexit with a calm, almost professorial demeanor. But this was different. This was personal, and it was a direct challenge to his core belief in global cooperation. He sat in the cabinet meeting room, a space of polished wood and hushed tones, surrounded by his ministers and top economic advisors. The mood was one of suppressed panic. The initial data on the impact of the new Trump tariffs was already coming in, and the projections were grim. Sectors of the Canadian economy were beginning to seize up. Supply chains were being rerouted at immense cost. The country's farmers, manufacturers, and small business owners were feeling the sting of a trade war that they had no hand in starting. The consensus in the room was clear: Canada had to retaliate. But the debate was about how. One minister argued for a proportional response, a tariff on American cars to match the tariffs on Canadian steel. Another suggested targeting agricultural goods, perhaps dairy or beef, to hit back at Trump's heartland voters. The ideas were all conventional, all part of the established playbook for a trade dispute. Each proposal was a mirror image of Trump's own tactics, a predictable move in a game of checkers. But Carney sat and listened, his expression unreadable, his mind working on a different level. He wasn't thinking about tariffs, he was thinking about psychology. He remembered a lesson he had learned years ago, during his time at Goldman Sachs. A seasoned mentor had told him, "You don't win a game of high-stakes poker by showing your opponent what you have. You win by making them think you have something completely different." That lesson had stayed with him, and now, it seemed more relevant than ever. He had to make Trump believe he was playing a different game entirely. When it was his turn to speak, a silence fell over the room. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table.